Yeah. Alrighty. Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased and honored to be part of this conference. It's been a great learning experience for me. And also, before starting, I wanted to take a moment and thank people in the department who really helped with this conference. And I've been kind of in touch with them. Cardelen, Kothar, Isa, they have been doing a great job. Thank you so much for your help. Uh, Another introductory point, the title of my talk has changed from the original submission to the conference, but the arguments and the logic and the content is basically the same. This is a second chapter of my dissertation, so it's natural to kind of change over time. Perfect. So the agenda for the talk today is that firstly, I'll just discuss the main question about evolution or macroevolution of the brain uh, that I want to discuss. And then I will set a framework to better understand the question. Here, I'll discuss concepts like major evolutionary transition, major cognitive transition, evolutionary contingency. And then I'll try to reformulate the main question and an answer to it that I call adaptationist answer, reformulate it and see if there is another way to look at it and another way to answer it. And then I'll end with some conclusion and implications of my argument. Perfect. So the main question kind of starts from a very simple point. At the end of his great book, Charles Darwin, The Origin of Species, he talks about evolution starting from very simple and humble origins and ends up with very complex and wonderful form of life. And then if we apply that question to nervous systems and to brains, a question would be how do we get throughout the macroevolution increasingly more cognitive complexity and more complex brains? What can explain that? And one possible and a little bit obvious answer is that directional persistent selection could explain that. We have a selective advantage for cognitive complexity, and the cognitive evolution would look like climbing up an inevitable ladder. Um, and some people have kind of suggested this with varying, a little bit of variation and difference. We have Dennett, we have Conway Morris, we have Ginsberg and Jablonka, and we also have Paul Chiswick. The idea is that they define some notion of cognitive fitness. It could be that adaptive improvisation that cognition enables organism with, or it could be different ways of learning and more efficient ways of problem solving. All these elements give you some sort of a fitness that lead evolution to select it and make it more complex over time. Some people even go much more hardcore on this. People like Conway Morris believe that we can treat evolution in a very robust and convergent way, in a way that he thinks if we replay the tape of evolution over and over again, we'll end up with the very similar outcomes like this super intelligent latest product of evolution that we call Homo sapiens. And he says we will end up with kind of similar morphofunctional destinations that evolution will hit upon on every replay. And as you might guess, Ginsberg and Jablonka, they talk about attractor points. They think that evolution goes through some major steps, and these major steps, because they are very fitness enhancing, are attractor points. And no matter where you start, the evolution will always hit upon the same attractor points. Then it talks about evolutionary revolutions and evolutionary cranes, and these are tools that evolution will rediscover over and over again to increase the cognitive complexity. Perfect. So just to go back, so the question is clear. The answer is that we have directional, persistent selection, not just overpopulation, but over the course of the whole macroevolution that goes for more complex brains. So to understand what kind of commitments or implication this answer has, I thought it's good to have an intuitive grasp over a distinction in evolutionary literature between adaptivity and adaptability, or adaptivity or evolvability. So take the example of bats and dolphins. They have echolocation, a very distinct, interesting cognitive capacity. The idea is that evolution can get this generic brain, this shared toolbox of mammalian brain, and in a specific context, it could make it the most adaptive for that environment. So evolution will select cognitive adaptiveness of mammalian brain. And we know from works of people like Mike Anderson and Barbara Finley that brains are not, as opposed to the older mosaic view of the brain, we have this view of generic brains that are pretty much flexible and plastic, and they could be adaptive in different ways. However, evolution cannot simply get a generic mammalian brain and give it a syntactical language competency. For that, the evolution needs to change the horizon of cognitive adaptability. It has to not only fine-tune the shared cognitive toolbox of the mammalian brain, but change the whole toolbox, change the whole computational architecture of the brains to get something like language capacity in humans. So that's kind of an intuitive grasp of when we talk about the difference between adaptivity and adaptability. Evolution needs to not only increase adaptivity or adaptiveness, but also increase the evolvability of the brains. And then the selectionist or adaptationist answer to the question would be, does selection or can selection explain both increasing cognitive adaptiveness and cognitive evolvability throughout the course of macroevolution? And the adaptationists like Conway Morris, Dennett, Ginsberg, Jablonka seem to believe that yes, the selection for adaptiveness in population, that over generation they will be more cognitively fit for their environment, also push species and lineages and clades towards higher cognitive evolvability. Cognitive evolvability can roughly be defined as the capacity of a lineage and its cognitive and it's the computational architecture of the brain to show more variability and variation, and then evolution will select those variants that have higher possibility, or those species that have higher possibility for cognitive adaptiveness. Another example that might help here is that moving from decentralized nervous system to centralized nervous system. So one key distinction is that in decentralized nervous system, the input, the input that the organism will transform into a behavioral output will not be centralized and kind of processed in a central command situation. So we have from one point to another point kind of input output without the centralization. And no matter how much evolution push that decentralized nervous system to become more adaptive, it still needs to increase the adaptability. So choose a centralized nervous system, and it opens a new realm of a new horizon of problem solving. Animals with organism with centralized nervous system could do some sorts of learning and problem solving that decentralized one cannot even start to approach. Perfect. So that's kind of a understanding. Now that we have an intuitive grasp over the question and the answer, let's discuss more technical terms that we could use to reformulate the question. So there is a talk about major transitions in evolution and evolutional cognition. This term was firstly introduced by people like Saberi and Maynard Smith. They talked about major transition in evolution, and their idea was if evolution not only upgrade its products, but also upgrade its tools. So every major change in the tools of evolution, like units of inheritance and units of selection, are considered a major evolutionary transition. For example, moving from unicellularity to multicellularity increased leads to a new Darwinian population, a bigger multicellular organism, and it is equipped with a new system of inheritance that it's called epigenetic inheritance system. And then later on, people start to reflect on Smith and Saberi contribution, and especially people like Gottfried Smith and Stanley talked about how major evolutionary transition could be understood as changes in condition of evolvability. So every major step, and the lists are different. This is like the original list of the major transition, but every major transition could be understood as a change in condition of evolvability of life, that is, change in the units of inheritance and units of selection. And then this same transitional thinking was applied to cognitive evolution by people like Baron and Andrew Baron and his colleagues, and Ginsberg and Jablonka. They have used the term cognitive transition in the most systematic, conceptually coherent way. And for them, major evolutionary transition are changes in conditions of cognitive evolvability. So for Baron and colleagues, changes in computational architecture would constitute change in a condition of cognitive evolvability. And these are examples of a computational architecture. That is a brain of a hydria, that is a decentralized nervous system. Then we get a centralized nervous system. The next major transition is in terms of what they call recurrent computational architecture. And then we have other forms. And Ginsberg and Jablonka kind of tried to define major transition in terms of types of learning, the type of learning that that computational architecture enabled that organism to have. Here's a table of the major transitions, and in a paper I've argued that the list of major cognitive transition, or MCT, kind of overlap with each other. So the first one is transition to decentralized nervous system and in hydria, and then for them is the transition from non-neural to neural organisms. And the second one is centralized computational architecture in flatworms, and the accompanying type of learning for them is limited associative learning. That is when an organism could take an input, process it, and from the whole body, and coherently produce behavioral output in a way that increases its fitness. And then we have unlimited associative learning for Ginsberg and Jablonka. This is the biological marker for consciousness. And this is embodied in recurrent computational architecture, which is basically defined in terms of the informational flow in the brain, where the brain has a dedicated brain region for memory to capture multimodal input, keep it for a while, and then use it in a behavioral output, while here we don't have a memory section. And then we have imaginative brains in laminated computational architecture, higher computational complexity. And then finally, we have human brain, the last transition, which for both of them, linguistic capacity is kind of distinctively about human cognition. Perfect. So if we can define MET, major evolutionary transition, as changes in condition of life evolvability, and major cognitive transition as changes in condition of cognitive evolvability, the question that can selection explain both increase in cognitive adaptiveness and adaptability could be reformulated as can selection be posited as this overpowering evolutionary force or evolutionary factor that explain MCTs. So one should notice that if we consider MCTs as kind of being explained by this overpowering force of selection, we are committing to the view of MCTs being kind of attractor points, kind of a strong morphofunctional destination that evolution will hit upon over and over again. So we kind of understand cognitive evolution in this adaptationist view in a very robust convergent view as opposed to a contingent view. So here I should very briefly define terms contingency and convergence in evolutionary literature. Contingency is normally defined as sensitivity of evolutionary process to changes in its initial conditions and kind of a past dependency of the evolutionary process. So like in the famous, this term was systematically introduced by Stephen Jay Gould. So in his famous thought experiment, he was like, if we rewind the tape of evolution to, let's say, Cambrian explosion and replay it again, will we hit upon the same outcomes over and over again, given that we change a little bit of initial conditions? And if we hit upon same outcomes, that's a very convergent process. If not, it's a contingent one. And convergence is normally defined when evolutionary pathways kind of converge upon this functional, optimal destination, no matter where you, no matter which kind of a different initial conditions you consider for it. And then the question will become, for the adaptationist view of cognitive evolution, is that true? Can we consider major cognitive transition, MCTs, a convergent evolutionary process? And before I kind of debate or push back against that view a little bit, we have to define different meanings of contingency. Philosophers of biology have kind of tried to make Gould's view of contingency more conceptually coherent and more precise for the taste of analytical philosophers. So Betty kind of defines, John Betty defines contingency in terms of sensitivity to the initial condition of evolution or causal dependence and unpredictability of evolutionary process. Eric Desjardins, which is my supervisor, he kind of, and was a student of Betty in UBC, he kind of builds on that and defines contingency mostly in terms of historicity and past dependence of evolutionary process. To give you a simple example, when you are building a house at the beginning, you have multiple choices. But whatever choices you make in the first stage will limit your possible choices in the second stage, and that also limit your choices at the third stage in how you build your house. So that's kind of the past dependency that we are looking at in Desjardins. And I think it's kind of coherent with Betty. He was very faithful to his teacher. And then we have Rachel Powell, in a very great book, Contingency and Convergence, 2020. She kind of discusses the previous accounts of contingency, and she says these are too permissive, too inclusive of a concept that doesn't really capture what Gould was interested in. And she says we have to define contingency as changes in evolutionary outcome in a way that if we do not any change to the initial condition, but marginal changes, we still get radically divergent outcomes. And she says that is important because Gould was interested in mass extinction and faunal turnovers in that has happened a few times in the course of evolution. And she says Gould is also interested in developmental entrenchment. So if we get similar outcome, but that similar outcome is not the result uh, of selection, but is merely the result of similar body plans that goes through inheritance, that will not count as a genuine case of convergence, but as a case of still contingent outcomes. One thing that is interesting about all these approaches is that they have an event-first approach to evolutionary contingency. That is, an evolution process is defined as contingent insofar as the outcome is contingent. The outcome is an event. But we can have another, and this is my distinction, another approach to evolutionary contingency that is of Derek Turner. He defined contingency mostly in terms of a process that is unbiased species sorting at the species level. That is how, if we have, let's say, an event of mass extinction and some species go extinct and some survive, and the reason that they survive is not merit-based. It's not because they had a had a had a good functional trait, but it was merely because of chance, then we have a case of unbiased species sorting as opposed to a biased one that in case of environmental disruptions or any other factors, we could have a biased species sorting in which only those species and those lineages will survive that had a long-term merit to survive the environmental disruptions. So there are two interesting implications for these two approaches to evolution contingency. The first one is, under the event-first approach, evolution contingency is a matter of degree. So it's true that natural selection can give us optimal outcomes, but it will always give us those optimal outcomes within the boundaries of historical and physiological constraints within which evolution works. So every evolutionary outcome is to some degree contingent and to some degree convergent. You could not do either or. It's kind of a both. And then it's also kind of very sensitive to the perspective that we take. So this is Godfrey Smith and Wilkins in 2009. They talk about adaptive landscape. And he says, you don't really have to debate each other a lot about how contingent an outcome is. It really depends on your perspective. If you get or your grain of analysis, if you get a macro perspective of all the possible worlds of evolutionary outcomes, and you see some optimal evolutionary product, and you put it in that context, you see that, oh my God, it's there could be so much more, so much better optimal traits that is not even traversed, like evolution has not even come up with. But if you get a meso or middle level view, you'll see that evolution is kind of optimal because you're limiting the space of possible worlds. And then if you go very micro and look at one adaptive hell very closely, you will see that the traits are not really on the dot optimal. There are ways that they could have been more optimal, but given their evolutionary past dependence, they are kind of relatively optimal. So in this way, and this is why most evolutionary biologists are kind of dissatisfied with the concept of contingency. It seems to be a metaphysical modal concept that is not really empirically tractable for evolutionists, and they just, maybe it's a good concept for philosophers to do philosophical reflections, but it's not in the serious business of doing hardcore evolutionary biology. That, however, I think could change if we take a process-first approach to evolutionary contingency. In this view, we see it is not a matter of degree, it's a matter of either or, whether an evolutionary process is is contingent or not, because a species sorting is either biased or unbiased. And in successive round of a species sorting, it happens in either a heterogeneous or homogeneous regime of evolutionary forces. This is a, a table from, or like a picture from Makshi, 1994, where he discussed passive or driven evolutionary trends. And a passive evolutionary trend happens in this 1A, in a heterogeneous regime of evolutionary factors where those vectors could be selective or any other evolutionary factor that kind of pushes evolutionary trends to be either passive or driven. Like an example, in the increase of the body size in horses has been considered to be a driven evolutionary trend. That is, not only one population of horses over generation tend to increase their body size, but also a whole subclad or whole clad of horses from different species over time kind of tend to have a driven trend, that is the minimum value to the maximum one acts like this. But recently we have kind of reconsidered that, and some evolutionary biologists have argued that is actually a passive trend. So trends are this kind of a increase in a persistent increase in a value of a specific trait, and it could be the result over long geological times, and it could be a result of an overpowering persistent directional selection that in that case is a driven trend, or it could be just a random walks of evolutionary processes and a kind of a passive diffusion if it happens within a bounded space, like there is a physiological constraint or some sort of a historical constraint that doesn't allow the value to drop over some value. So it's not physiologically possible for mammals to get smaller from a certain size. But the fact that they increase their size doesn't mean that necessarily there was this persistent long-term selection that was pushing them to increase their size. Alrighty, so in this case, as we see, trends could either be passive or driven. They could not be both. So they are either contingent or passive. Alrighty, so kind of a Turner in a 2015 chapter, he talks about explaining evolutionary trends, and he proposed this working hypothesis that he says we could make evolutionary contingency more tractable, more empirically tractable if we treat them as unbiased species sorting, and unbiased species sorting over evolutionary time produce passive evolutionary trends. So if we treat passive evolutionary trend as a marker, then we can have a more tractable notion of evolutionary contingency. And my working hypothesis is that if we consider MCTs and increasing cognitive adaptiveness and adaptability of brains over time as a trend, and if we can show that that trend is passive, then we could say that in a tractable way that evolution of cognition, macroevolution of cognition is contingent process, and we don't need to posit this long-term directional selection to explain increasing cognitive complexity of the brain. We don't need directional selection. Stabilizing selection and other evolutionary factors could play a role in this. And this is kind of goes back to the point when Paul was talking yesterday about what kind of explanation or assumption are the best. Here, I think for me to show that adaptationism is not explanatory apt, I think we have to look at the whole larger context of the trend here. And if we can show that it's contingent, you could actually show why we shouldn't use an adaptationist assumption. Perfectly. So let's go back to contingency of major cognitive transition, and I'm kind of close to the conclusion. So if we consider MCTs as an event, we could say that each MCT is kind of, according to Betty and Desjardins, they're kind of contingent and also kind of convergent. And it also depends on your grain of analysis. If you use parallel, we could say, well, if you can show me that MCTs are actually a result of selection, not other developmental entrenchment or other evolutionary factors, then they are radically contingent. But if we see them as a pattern, as a process, in order for us to see if MCTs are contingent or not, we don't look at individual event. We ask if the whole trend is passive or driven. So we could actually, I think, infer the contingency from each other. So if we show that each MCT as events are contingent, radically contingent, we could kind of infer that the whole pattern is a passive trend and it's contingent. But that's very hard to do. It's kind of empirically tractable. We don't have the fossil records. But a more manageable task is to start and see if and there are interesting statistical methods and techniques to kind of figure out if the trend is passive or driven. If we can show that the trend is passive, then we could say that we don't need adaptationist assumption, and each transition could be explained by a few evolutionary factors, including selection, but note that selection is not the overpowering evolutionary factor. Perfect. So here's kind of me trying to show the major the MCTs in a passive trend. And here the vectors could be either selection for cognitive fitness, but it could also be a selection against more cognitive fitness because it's metabolically very expensive to have bigger brain, more complex brain, or it could be any other contingent factor. It could be a drift, or it could be a mutational random walk. Perfect. So there are some suggestive evidence that shows that the trend for increasing cognitive complexity is a passive trend. Firstly, we have cases of neural simplification, or when we have organisms who are very ecologically specialized or they are ecomorph, they lose their cognitive complexity. Like the most famous example is like some colonial insects. When there is a division of labor between foragers and soldiers, the soldier insects actually lose some parts of their brain, and they are much more, because the task that they have to do is much simpler. They don't need a complex brain for it. And that's a case of, in several cases of domestication or ecomorph, formation of ecomorph. And then we have, as Baron and his colleagues has pointed out, MCTs are really very much constrained by metabolic energy efficiency, and each MCT will happen only when we have a change in computational architecture that is at the same time very energy efficient for the whole metabolism of the organism, and otherwise kind of a metabolic energy efficiency and the cost of having more complex brain pushes back against organism getting more complex brain. And generally, it's very hard to show that the trend in macroevolution is a driven one. And unless proven wrong, it's safe to assume that trends in long-term evolution are a passive trend. There are other cases, but there are studies like I think it's a Cambridge study in 2010 that shows that macroevolution of mammalian brain is not actually a robust macroevolutionary pattern, but you could see it as more contingent. So there are more evidence to discuss, and I discuss it with more details in my chapter and my research. But here I kind of have to skip it for the interest of time. Finally, so if MCTs actually are behaving like a passive trend, these kind of implications follow. We don't need a persistent directional overpowering selection to explain them. we have to see that it's a heterogeneous regime of evolutionary factors where selection for cognitive complexity kind of come into conflict and sometimes cooperate with selection for metabolic fitness. And other evolutionary factors also play a role. And we shouldn't see cognitive evolution as this inevitable climbing up the ladder. And in explaining each MCT, one should emphasize the role of contingent factor, especially given the recent debate in the evolution of language between adaptationist and non-adaptationist camps. And it's a very severe debate, and it's hard to make it decidable. I think if you look at the more general background of cognitive evolution, it will be more decidable whether language is a fully adaptive communicative tool or it's not a fully adaptive communicative tool, as people like Chomsky has suggested. I think I'll end there. Thank you so much.
That was great. Thank you so much. So we have some time for a few questions. Ready to see a hand up?
I was a bit confused about when you said that a species sorting is either biased or unbiased, and that doesn't admit degrees, right? Or at least you contrasted, whether that admits degrees with the prior notion. So I was just wondering if you could kind of explain what you meant by that, and whether that kind of how much of your subsequent points about contingency rely on that kind of binary notion existing.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a great question. So when we say a species sorting is either biased, or successive round of species sorting is either biased or unbiased, or a trend is either passive or driven, note that we are not picking out a modal property of a specific event, but rather we are picking out a process that has happened. And that process is called a heterogeneous or a homogeneous regime of evolutionary factors. Then the way to kind of, and also you could say that homogeneity or heterogeneity is a matter of degree. Why do you have to say it's either or? So the idea is there are interesting statistical properties that you could show that, like, if the minimum value has stayed kind of a close to minimum throughout the evolution, macroevolution, it's more likely that it is a passive trend and it's a heterogeneous. But if we see that it is even the minimum value has increased substantially in different subclads of a lineage, then it's a more driven trend. And there are, I think it was a 3 statistical test about whether, so in this guy, the chances of, if we pick out a fossil or an organism from here, the chances of let's say if it's a body size, the body size here, if it should not be bigger or equal to the body size here. The body size here should be kind of tilted and driven. So if we just like, the idea, I guess, is if we agree that there are interestingly and explanatorily relevant features that we could pick in a heterogeneous or a homogeneous regime of evolutionary factors, then we could say, as far as our explanatory strategy is relevant, we could treat a trend as passive or driven, regardless of whether an independent outcome is relatively contingent or relatively non-contingent. So it's more of an explanatory strategy. It's not trying to say, look at this specific outcome. There's a modal or a metaphysical property of this outcome, or counterfactual property of it, we call it contingency, and it's definitely either or. It's more of the general trend. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, the basis of my question is that in general, you would expect all contingency to admit of degrees, right? That's kind of like how much do you have to change the initial conditions to get some different outcome? That's going to give you some notion of like the degree of contingency. So I'm just wondering are you essentially just defining these terms in such a way that they, are binary? And if so, then couldn't you just do the same thing with the event-based notion of contingency and get a similar kind of product at the end?
Well, I'm not stipulating it. It's a work of Maxey, Turner, and other evolutionary biologists that have found throughout their evolutionary studies that it is useful and it gives you some explanatory power if you distinguish between a passive and driven trend in a non-degree way. And I think it's merely a metaphysical debate whether we should discuss that no, actually it is still a matter of degree, if you will. You could say that. But as far as this explanatory strategy is concerned, we are not looking at specific outcomes. We are looking at, that's why I'm calling it process first. We are looking at the whole evolutionary process, and we are putting it in a context of a regime of evolutionary factors, and you could meaningfully, with statistically relevant and robust way, show whether the trend here is passive or driven. So it's not about the specific outcome to say, well, counterfactually, if you change that initial condition a little bit this way, it still would be different or not. It's not supposed to pick out any property of specific outcomes. It's supposed to pick out a historically concrete period of evolution that could in a meaningful way be described as either heterogeneous or homogeneous regime of evolutionary factors. Does that make sense?
A bit, but I won't hog the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. So I was reminded when you brought up the sort of idea of social insects kind of becoming less cognitively complex over time, of the work of like William Morton Wheeler, have you ever heard of him?
No.
He's an entomologist who was working in the 1920s. He coined the term superorganism, but he basically thought that humans were undergoing what we now call a major evolutionary transition to become a sort of superorganismic structure. And he thought that we're basically becoming like social ants. But he thought that the reason was that there was this kind of macroevolutionary law of specialization, ecological specialization, division of labor. So we were all becoming really stupid because we were dividing our labor amongst ourselves. And I guess, so being reminded of that just made me want to ask, do you think that your view could be compatible with the idea that what we think of as like kind of convergent cognitive complexity could be a genuinely convergent trend, but just of some other thing? Do you know what I mean? Like
other things,
as in, so something like ecological specialization, that there could be some kind of macroevolutionary law at work here, which is why we see what seems to be increasing cognitive complexity, and that these are not kind of contingent, but they are not, they're convergent sort of instances of a different kind of law. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think, yeah, one could say, as a rule of thumb, if we have throughout evolution, if we have a kind of stable environment or ecological environment for organisms, they tend to become they tend to have ecomorph formation, or they tend to have ecological specializations, and that kind of pushes back against cognitive complexity. But it is like any other model in evolutionary biology. It is you have to meet the condition. If any one of the things are not plugged in, then you will not have that outcome. But in terms of general major evolutionary transition in life, the transition from is called transition to eusociality. It's one of the other major transition that Saberi and Maynard Smith consider. And I think it's pretty obvious that major evolution transition in life, not in cognition, kind of act like a very passive trend. Because for that, we have to have the minimum value kind of at least increased a little bit. And as it's famously said by Gold, we are still living in the age of bacteria, like the most fed and most diverse group of species on the planet to this day is bacteria. So the minimum value has stayed here throughout the whole few billion years of evolution. And that's like, if you don't pass the test even at that level, you don't need to go. And then transition to eusociality happens in some branches of species and doesn't happen in all of them. And that's another sign that it's not a driven trend. So whenever you get a intelligent primate like humans, you don't have to assume that it's convergent. We are going to look like colonial insects. No, like it's a very contingent thing. So that kind of proves the point of me arguing that it's a passive trend.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Any other questions? All right. Please join me in thanking Farid again for his presentation.